Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupola, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today, I'm talking to Alexander McKeever, a researcher based in Amman, Jordan, and author of the newsletter This Week in Northern Syria. Hi, Alexander. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Diego. Thanks for having me.
And I should reiterate, This Week in Northern Syria is an essential monitoring tool for anybody following Syria. I recommend signing up on your Substack. Can you say the address?
It's akmckeever.substack.com.
Great. So it's been nearly 6 months since the Assad regime fell on December 8th, 2024. Syria has since begun a long transition process to rebuild the nation, its economy, and foreign relations after more than 50 years of one-family rule. A big part of that involves efforts to consolidate power and armed forces under the central government in Damascus, which is headed by President Ahmed al-Shara and Foreign Minister Assad al-Shaybani. Did I get that right?
Shway.
Notably, the foreign minister, Shaybani, was pursuing a PhD in Turkey before his appointment. He was one of more than 3.5 million Syrian refugees that lived in Turkey at the height of the civil war. Now that it's over, some have started to move back. For many, many reasons, Turkey's future is deeply tied to Syria's future and vice versa. The two nations are bound politically, economically, and also on a personal level after their shared experiences through the war. This is true for not only top officials, but also business owners who forged relations in exile. Many Syrians now speak Turkish, and if not, their children probably do after attending school in Turkey for more than a decade. There's a lot to cover here. We'll get into the domestic and foreign policy developments in Syria's transition process, but before we start, let me reiterate, this is a live recording with a live audience. We aim to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour. I'll start with some broad questions, and listeners are welcome to send questions as we discuss different topics about Syria. You can submit a question on the Substack app or on the webpage where you're watching this. We'll try to answer all the questions we get. Now, Alexander, to start, you monitor Syria developments in your newsletter. There's a lot going on. To kick off, could you give listeners an outline of the main developments you're tracking right now and maybe bullet points before we get into the details?
Yeah, so I started my newsletter a couple of years ago covering the areas that are under the control of the SDF, as well as the areas that were controlled by the SNA and Turkey. The terminology kind of is a little vague. But so generally, since the fall of the regime, I've been tracking developments related to these regions in particular, as well as the nationwide context as well. So I would say that the main points I'm looking at are obviously the negotiations ongoing between the SDF and the Syrian government based in Damascus, as well as the situation going on the borders between these two separately controlled areas. Additionally, I'm looking at intra-Kurdish politics, the international context, the international recognition of the government, and the role specifically of the U.S. and Turkey, because these are the most active countries within northern and eastern Syria. Furthermore, the integration of the SNA, the Syrian National Army, which is the Turkish-backed collection of militias, and the civilian government in these areas. I'd say also the Islamic State activity, mostly within SDF areas, but recently we've seen some activity within the government-controlled areas. And finally, I'd say the situation with the Al-Hol camp and the Islamic State detainees, as well as IDPs in general in the northeast and in northern Aleppo, places like Afrin, and these issues related to this. So,
yeah, thank you. And we'll try to hit on all those points throughout this talk. And again, questions are welcome. And Alexander's already getting some fan mail, so good to see that in our comments. Thank you, Jake. Let's see, to start, over the weekend, a delegation of Kurdish parties held a meeting with the Damascus central government. This follows a March 10th agreement signed by Shara and SDF head Mazlum Abdi. The agreement aims to integrate civilian and military institutions between Damascus and the Kurdish groups in northeast Syria. The initial statements pretty much say that it was a positive, constructive atmosphere, and that both sides would try to make subcommittees to oversee integration. There's a lot of details. Just to give an example, the meeting explored mechanisms to facilitate the return of displaced persons to their areas while addressing the obstacles hindering their return. What do you make of that meeting? And can you comment on what these returns, what these obstacles to returns might be?
Yeah, so this is one of many meetings that have occurred since the March 10th agreement. Probably about maybe 5 to 6. This one was actually after a pause, so the it seems like the negotiation process had frozen a bit for various reasons. So it's good to see that it's restarted again. Overall, with the March 10th agreement, it was rather vague. It really left things up to the to future negotiations. The subcommittee thing is an important development because this was something that the agreement on March 10th had said would happen. But since then, we're 2 months later, 3 months later, that hadn't happened yet. And so these subcommittees will address all the various parts of government, the civilian local administration, all the various institutions there, and then maybe, eventually the military. What I will say about all this is that it's, I think it's going to be a very long process, very complicated. The two sides are starting, quite far apart in the negotiations, particularly over what the shape of the future government will be and the issue of centralization versus federalism. So right now, I'd say that there's little files within the broader administration or the broader agreement, broader negotiations that I think we'll keep seeing these little agreements. Right now, this one apparently talked a lot about education, which has been an ongoing issue. This is an issue that's predated the fall of the regime, because the autonomous administration, the government in North and East Syria, has its own education system. This is controversial because it's not accredited, and then also it has ideological elements that some people object to. But the accreditation, I think, is the real issue. And so before this, people were either traveling to areas under the control of the regime or going in Hasake and Qamishli city. The regime had these little pockets. And so they could take tests, the standardized tests at the end of the year, in these little pockets. But since then, the government hasn't opened up test centers in the Qamishli, Hasake, Raqqa. So this is a sticking point. And they're basically just trying to figure out how they can smooth this over and then start maybe integrating the education system.
Yeah, which for me, noticing this statement with focus on exams in the second point out of 4 points that they have in their statement, right? I mean, it seems like a very specific detail. I know it's important, but I was imagining more focus on military aspects of the relation and security. What do you make of this focus on the finer points of integration instead of the overarching security architecture for Syria?
Well, I mean, I guess you could view it as sort of a trust building mechanism. Also, it's something that affects tens, hundreds of thousands of students within North and East Syria. And there's been protests about them not coming to an agreement within the local communities. So to me, this makes sense. It's something that's it's definitely easier than the issue of military integration, which, we're talking about integration between the SDF and the government, but the government is not an integrated military. This is kind of, I think, maybe has been smoothed over in the coverage because it's very complicated. But there's over 100 different groups that were the armed opposition that are now vaguely integrated under Damascus. We're not talking about the SDF. We're not talking about the Druze militias in Sweda either. These are all, the groups that are in Idlib or in Aleppo or also in Daraa in the south. So military integration on these people that are all nominally on the same side is like vaguely occurring. But yeah, long story short, the military integration with the SDF's logistically going to be quite tricky.
Yeah, and that's a long process. And we'll talk about foreign relations in the Turkey process as well, because I'm guessing that's all related, right? Um, how would you describe the security situation on the ground? Um, there's different areas, obviously, with different circumstances, but can you give an overview of what you're seeing in your monitoring work?
Yeah, so as you said, it really depends place to place. I think uh, in parts of bigger cities, also it depends on the cities. Like Damascus is quite safe, or large portions of it. Um, yeah, I mean, I'd say it's really regional, and it depends also on what these areas were before. In terms of like Idlib, I haven't heard of any real security issues. I mean, that's the administration that took over the entire country. In northern Aleppo, which was SNA controlled, there's a little bit of like, infighting that's happened, or some of the criminality stuff. And then when you get to areas that were like real hot beds, or real, what's the word, like the, center, like the main constituency of the regime, in places, where there's a high Alawi population, but in general, parts of Hama, parts of the coast, there the situation's much tenser, I'd say.
Has it stabilized, or is it kind of, how would you
So
describe it?
I mean, things started, when the regime fell, things were came across as more stable than many people expected. But then obviously, going into January and February, then especially with the massacres that happened on the coast, things have deteriorated in points. I think it really depends where you're speaking about. It's very local dynamics in some of these areas. I'd say
Yeah.
we haven't returned to the levels of violence that we saw in March. Um, there's been little flare ups here and there, but we're talking about a entire series of events where over 100 pro-government security officials and military people were killed, and then over likely 1,000 to 1,500 civilians were massacred. So we thankfully, we haven't gone up to those.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and you visited Syria. When was that?
That was around Eid, so 2 months ago.
Yeah, and how do the reports compare with what you saw, and where were you?
So I was just in Damascus. I was there. I'd never been to Syria before. After working on it for years, I'm living in Jordan, so it's now pretty easy actually. So I was in Damascus and around Damascus, meeting up with some friends. So I wouldn't say that it was a particularly illuminating visit in terms of the overall security situation, but I'd say overall in Damascus. My main takeaways, I mean, I felt safe, and that's, it's bizarre at night with the lack of electricity. You're walking around pitch black streets, but even then, like, I didn't feel, in the areas I was in, didn't feel danger. I'd say the security felt very ad hoc. I mean, part of it, maybe if you have more experience being in places where security is handled by militias, you might come away with a different view. But for me, it, it's checkpoints of people that are not always in the same uniform. Some of them seem quite young. They've some of them have their faces covered. Um, Definitely around the Eid holiday, saw like a stepping up of security. But overall, there actually wasn't too much. Like on the road outside Damascus, there's really not many checkpoints. You get waved through the
Hmm.
checkpoints. So yeah, I'd
Yeah.
say overall ad hoc is my main takeaway.
What about infrastructure, water, electricity, ability to live there? Did you see? Basically, I want to ask about whether people can return. How do you see the infrastructure?
So that also depends a lot on where you're talking. I mean, if you just look at Damascus, the center of the city is fairly untouched. I mean, a friend I was with who'd been before the war was saying that like things to him looked a lot dirtier because the lower quality gasoline and everything, and just things were a little run down. But the war didn't come to the old city or the central areas of Damascus, but you go like half a kilometer further east, and you're in the Ghouta. You're seeing like the what you imagine, like the what people have in their head of like Syria. I mean, it looks like Gaza basically, with like completely destroyed urban areas. So that really depends where you're talking really.
Mhm.
And then for electricity, I mean, in Damascus, so many things are running off generators. So when I was there, it was still like not many hours. I'm not sure exactly how many hours a day they say is right now. Then I think it was like 4 or something. But you're in a lot of places with 24-hour electricity because they're running off generators.
Yeah, and just on a practical level, cell phone service, currencies, what were you using?
So you go to the Sarafid exchange. $100 gets you a stack of $5,000 bills. That's like that big. So yeah, it's and it's kind of crazy. You have Bashar al-Assad's face on the 2,000 lira pound or pound bill. So yeah, you're using the old money that's actually still being printed and delivered from Russia since the regime fell. So they're talking about changing that soon.
Mhm.
Um,
Any Turkish liras in the mix?
Not in Damascus. I mean, if you go north, yeah. I mean, I saw one or two Turkish businesses that I assume are new. That I don't think you would have seen that before in Damascus. But again, things are very different. It really depends where you are.
Mhm. And your cell phone? Well, how was that work?
I got a Syriatel SIM card. Um,
Okay,
though it was 3G. I think they're talking about going up to 5G soon.
great, great, great. Yeah, so to talk about refugee returns, UNHCR, as of May 22nd of this year, estimates about 500,000 Syrians went back to Syria from neighboring countries since the regime change. And according to the Turkish Interior Minister, half of those people, 200,000, Syrian refugees, left Turkey to go to Syria. So 500,000 in total, half of them from Turkey. Uh, what do you think about bigger return levels? Because half the population changed, right? They changed location during the war. Many of them went to Europe. What was your impression? Where did you see people coming back? Because this is obviously a big topic here in Turkey, but also in Europe, many governments are already talking about whether it's safe to go back. What would you say based on what you saw in Damascus?
Um, so I say my anecdotal knowledge on this is probably more through talking to friends that were that are Syrian refugees. And it really depends, where they're from in Syria, where they ended up. I'd say it's hard to overall to say that there's like one narrative really. I have
Hmm.
friends that got to Europe somewhat recently and they want to go back really soon. Whereas I have friends that have lived in Europe for, close to 10 years or whatever, and they're not planning on going back. Or they're kind of torn. And yeah, I mean, again, it really depends where in Syria you're from, and what the context was of why you were seeking asylum and how long
Hmm.
you've been out of the country.
Yeah, for example, just to give an anecdote from here in Turkey, many people say they're waiting for the schools to reopen and their families moving with children, so they want to make sure there's a school system ready for their kids to enter when they go. So a lot of the people we talked to at Turkey Recap, um, back when the regime change began, they were saying maybe in the spring and then over summer we'll see how it goes. But I guess it really depends on circumstances, right? Uh, what about internal population migration? Because there's news about Arabs leaving Afrin, right? And UNHCR said that 1.2 million IDPs exist in Syria, internally displaced people. So, what do you make of reports of internal movements?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of internal movement. I've seen these stats. I can't really verify them, but this has been a big thing within the SDF Syrian government negotiations. Also, just yesterday, speaking about Afrin in particular, there's videos. So over the last couple of years, there's been these like villages. Some people call them settlement villages for IDPs. Some call them IDP camps in Afrin that were built. A bunch of them that house like thousands of IDPs, and there's videos being posted by a local media organization of these villages just being completely empty.
Mm-hmm.
I saw someone talking about Afrin in particular. I mean, there it really also depends on the area, because Afrin's made up of 7 different sub-districts, and I think it was Syria Direct was reporting on it, saying that in specific areas, most the IDPs have left and the armed groups have left, whereas in some areas, some of the armed groups are still there, and there's been less IDP movement in terms of people that moved in after the Turkish invasion.
And that's part of the March 10th agreement, from what I understand.
Yeah, well, so I think that the people leaving Afrin, that is not necessarily based on any government policy. I think this is just IDPs going back to their home areas or going closer or something, or moving in with family. I don't think that's a government policy. I've read some places that the government's trying to get the SNA factions to leave, or putting some pressure on them. I can't speak to the specifics of that. The what was in the agreement is basically from the SDF autonomous administration side, getting on in writing that they want the Afrini IDPs and the IDPs from Serikaniye, Russell in in Hasake, the Turkish controlled part of Hasake, to be to return as soon as possible. And there has been returns in Afrin. Is since the fall of the regime, there's been. I mean, I've seen reports of up to 70,000. I have no idea how to quantify that. But so people have been going back. What I've seen actually a bunch of recently is, so you had IDPs that took over people's apartments or were rented. Some of them, it wasn't necessarily the IDPs. It was the armed factions seized the apartments and then rented them to IDPs. It's case to case. But of these apartments, when Afrini former IDPs returned to Afrin, just being like completely gutted. So that's in the local Afrin context. That's a development that's been going on.
Yeah. And I guess we have to wait for media reports to understand more. Like, what is the media presence in some of these areas? Is it all social media?
Sorry, what was the last part?
Is it all social media, what you're basing this off of?
No, there's local media there too. Basically, I'd say after the fall of the regime, the areas, you haven't seen too many of the outlets that are based in northeastern Syria reporting in these areas. You have seen them reporting more in Damascus or also in Sweda, interestingly, but the media situation is basically the same as it was before the fall of the regime. Is you have these various outlets that are to varying degrees affiliated with what was the armed opposition or the opposition in general, civilian activist journalism. And now you have the taken over state media outlets, Sana, Ikhbariya, a number of these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In preparing for this, I was looking at Sana. It looks completely different than what I remember. Would you say it's a good source of information? Just wondering.
I mean, in the way that Anadolu Agency is a good source of information, if you're reporting on what the government's doing and saying, then it's useful. I wouldn't take, it's state journalism. It's like press releases, basically.
Got it.
And actually supposed to rebrand more in like the end of the month, I think. It's going to look even less 2000s.
Yeah. So we have a question from Monique. Do you know the security situation in Afrin and for Kurds in general in the SNA-dominated areas?
So it's slightly opaque. I'd say in general, one thing that's ever since the operation started in November that led to the fall of the regime, all the SNA groups have gotten, or almost all of them have gotten very quiet. So they used to like have their own social media presence. But now that's like completely gone. So from that side of things, it's a little hard to tell from that, like actual reporting on this. The government now, its security services, what's known as the General Security Directorate or Security Ministry or whatever, has entered these areas and does have security officials that are nominally in control of these areas. But at the same time, you still have the SNA groups, which were on one hand armed factions. They also operated a military police, and then there was a civil police that was affiliated with the civil administration. So these, to varying capacity, these groups are still there. I mean, I've read anecdotally that there's been people just sort of leaving these groups to go home now that there's like no war. And I think also it really depends on the groups. The SNA, we talk about it as the SNA, but it's really like not. It's a disparate group of 30 plus militias. Some of them are from different parts of the country. Some of them are more ideological, more Islamist. Some of them are much bigger and more influential. Some of them are very rooted in the local area. So, for example, in Azaz, which is right next to Afrin, the main group was Ajeba Shamiya, which the Levant Front, which was very much like of that town. So that's different from the other SNA groups that maybe are displaced from somewhere else in Syria. So overall, I'd say things are changing, but slowly. And the government overall, in terms of like basically everything, there's just like I think there's like a limited amount of state capacity. So there is this, effort to integrate these groups and integrate the security situation under Damascus, but it's a slow process because they're resource strapped, and yeah.
Yeah, and we invite more questions from the audience as we talk. I'm just wondering what you make of the lifting of sanctions from U.S. and I guess Europe now. Uh, how do you see that having impacts in the short term? I mean, in the long term, it will help reconstruction, but what do you think will be the first changes?
I mean, you'll definitely see more international business active. I am curious. I'm going back soonish. It's going to be interesting just to see what it is like. But I think you'll see maybe more regional businesses active, because all the secondary sort of freezing effects of sanctions will be gone. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak too in depth for that, but I think it'll just you'll see, more international presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and was there international presence when you were in Damascus? Did you see anything other than two Turkish shops that you mentioned?
Um, uh, I mean, there's definitely like way more products, Western products, or European products that are there that weren't there, in November. In terms of businesses, I'd have to think. I mean, this was 2 months ago.
No bags or tarps with certain logos on them.
Well, yeah, I see a lot of the UN tarps, but which I think is related to corruption and sort of people looting and selling off the UN tarps. But
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. When you were talking in the beginning about your bullet points, what do you mean by intra-Kurdish politics? What are the different groups, and what are you referring to when you say you're tracking that?
so, I mean, like all Kurdish politics, things are generally split between the supporters of Öcalan and the supporters of Barzani, and Talabani to a later point, it's a lesser degree. I mean, to try to make this quick, basically the first Kurdish parties, the first modern Kurdish parties, were founded in 1957, and then they all splintered into a giant web. Some were more affiliated with Barzani, some were affiliated with Talabani. Um, and then in the 80s, you had the PKK come in. The PKK entered Syria in about 1980, really quite soon after it was formed, and became like a second pole of Kurdish politics. Really, I mean, it had tactic agreements with the regime. There's a mutually beneficial relationship. So Kurdish politics in Syria was very much bifurcated between the people, the PYD, and the various parties allied with it. They were very active within the autonomous administration, going to represent the core of the autonomous administration. And then you had the ENKS, the Kurdish National Council, that was close to the Kurdistan government in Iraq.
Mhm.
And for years, you had various international actors, the U.S., some other ones, trying to get rapprochement and negotiations between these two sides, and it never went anywhere really. There was some agreements signed on paper, and these never actually really resulted in changes on the ground. But then, since the fall of the regime, there's been a real push. I mean, this ties into the PKK, Bacheli, Erdogan, whatever you want to call it. But so you had the U.S., France, and the Kurdistan government, and then also I think Dem Party was involved to some degree in terms of facilitating a unity agreement. And then this was signed. There was a conference in late April. I forget the date. Between these groups where they wrote up a 26th point agreement that was calling for federalism, decentralization, a bunch of stuff. And this is supposed to be a unity document that they're going to bring to Damascus. Now, it's unclear to me because the SDF already has an agreement with Damascus that was signed by Muslim Abdi on March 10th. That agreement, the government's recognizing the SDF as an actor, but I'm not quite clear how this unity agreement that's signed between the various Kurdish parties is going to be added into that process. But maybe I have to look up who was in this delegation. I think the delegation that we saw go to Damascus 2 days ago was still just from the autonomous administration. But
Mm.
that's something to watch. It's unclear to me what this will result in necessarily, or how the SDF will bring the other parties into the ongoing negotiations.
Yeah, and I think that's the main point that people are trying to understand, right? Is what will all these groups and different agreements amount to as the government tries to centralize, and how does the PKK peace process in Turkey impact this? Because from what I understand, the disarming and dissolution of PKK does not apply in Syria. Is that how you understand it?
It depends who you ask.
So what do you think?
I mean, well,
Or what have you
the SDF
understood?
says it doesn't. Turkey says it does. So, yeah. I mean,
SDF,
I think
SDF says no. You said SDF says it doesn't apply to them, right?
yeah. As soon as the agreement came out, Muslim Abdi said that he was happy it happened and it's good for the region, but it doesn't apply to the SDF.
Mhm.
Whereas Turkey's actually has pointed out to me recently that the National Security Council, whatever the meeting was in Turkey, like a week or two ago, that they actually used KCK in the list of acronyms. So it was before it was PYD, YPG, PKK. Now they've thrown KCK in there. I think Sina Amadar was saying to me that she thinks that's like, them just adding ammo for why this agreement uh,
Mhm.
uh, is includes the SDF. But I mean, I think so much of this is behind closed doors in terms of like the Turkish policy. I think we've definitely seen a shift in how Turkey's approached the SDF, due in part to the fall of the regime, but also especially due to the PKK process that's been going on. So when the regime fell, and when in the week leading up to that, because there was this SNA offensive against the SDF, Turkey, it seemed, was going to be very aggressive, and Russia had vacated these areas. The U.S., it was a little unclear what the U.S. was going to say and do. Eventually, the U.S. actually stepped in and sort of negotiated some sort of ceasefire. But since then, with the again the PKK process and the negotiations between the SDF and Damascus, Turkey's definitely stepped back a bit. The rhetoric's been uh, you know less antagonistic, um, and yeah, I think that they're happy right now to let the government figure it out. But I mean, every once in a while, like Erdogan recently said that the SDF stalling. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, and how's it going for attacks, air bombing in northeast Syria? I know that it's continuing in Iraq and Kurdish-held areas, and I'm wondering whether you're seeing basically stability in northeast Syria after the bombing near the dam and the different clashes that were going on there. How would you characterize it? Because I've also seen some SDF clashes with different groups.
yeah. So the Turkish side of the attacks have, from what I can tell, stopped. There was one or two incidents that it was unclear if it was some sort of IED or a Turkish airstrike, but the level of Turkish drone strikes that we saw up until uh, March or so has definitely dropped off. So it's not like what you see in Iraqi Kurdistan right now, where pretty regularly you're seeing Turkish airstrikes. And then in terms of the front lines, this is mostly around between Minbij and Kobani. There's two bridges. One is the dam, the Tishreen Dam. The other one's the Karakozak Bridge. Um, this has been the front line since January. This is as part of the SNA's offensive. They captured Minbij. The SDF partially withdrew, and then fighting's been going on along the riverbank. This dropped in intensity definitely since the March 10th agreement between Shara and Muslim Abdi, but there's still small clashes that are going on. Recently, there's been seemingly an uptick in tensions along the river. Um, there's been some clashes around the Tishreen Dam. Then there's been sort of reciprocal um, attacks or incidents of pressure. In Deir ez-Zor, the uh, local government, the provincial government, is trying to repair some of these bridges. And there's been reports that the SDF sent reinforcements and were kind of obstructing the repair of these bridges, which the bridges connect the government to the SDF areas. And then there's some water stations, like purification stations on the Euphrates that some people with the autonomous administration were trying to repair, and they apparently came under fire from SNA groups. So things have cooled down a lot. Uh, it's not completely deconflicted. And I think maybe because we did see a gap between the meetings between the two sides, so maybe with this recent visit to Damascus, and apparently today, I haven't, is still ongoing, but there's supposed to be another prisoner swap in Aleppo City. That's a local dynamic we can talk about later, but that hopefully these will mean that these sort of clashes and tensions will die down again.
When you say there's a gap, are you saying maybe there was a meeting in between the meetings?
No, I'm saying it seems like the process stalled out for a bit.
Okay.
There were reports that it had stalled, but
Okay.
now it seems like it's back on track again.
Okay. Yeah. And you detailed SDF SNA clashes. There's also been some activity from ISIS. Apparently, there were some arrests in different areas. How much of a threat is ISIS in Syria right now? Because that's a big factor in US's role there.
Right. So they're a destabilizing factor. They're not going to return to July 2014. Like that's the threat of ISIS is not that they're going to return to that they're going to take back territory. Initially, after the fall of the regime, there was very little ISIS activity. In the recent months, we've seen an uptick of attacks, mostly targeting the SDF in areas that had been sort of hotspots for these attacks before. Talking like central Deir ez-Zor, some parts of southern Hasakeh, some parts of Raqqa. So that's kind of gone back up to the levels that it was in November. And then throughout, like constantly, you have these SDF or Asayish, the SDF aligned internal security forces, launching raids that are supported by the coalition to capture suspected ISIS militants. So I'd say that this is, yeah, again, back to the levels that roughly that it's been the last couple of years. And the change recently is that there was a major security operation by the Damascus government in Aleppo city, busting an Islamic State cell. And then a day or two later, there was I think it was a car bomb outside a police station in the government-controlled parts of Deir ez-Zor. And then uh, even more recently, there was a IED attack in southern Syria that the Islamic State actually claimed. So that was the first claimed attack against the Syrian government, the new government.
Mm-hmm. And then we continue to see talk about Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq. Is it making a joint coalition to monitor and contain ISIS, basically? Which brings me to the U.S. and Tom Barak, the new envoy to Syria, who's also the ambassador here in Turkey. He raised the American flag in Damascus, and he seems to be quite active since he arrived last month in the region. What do you make of his presence, and what's it mean for U.S. policy in what's going on here?
So, Trump administration, it's very hard to say what's going on. But I think generally things have been positive since Trump's visit to the Gulf. Obviously, lifting sanctions was huge. It seems like Turkey and Saudi are on the same page when it comes to Syria, which is definitely good for Syria. With Barack, I mean, I honestly didn't know anything about him until recently, until he was appointed. I've learned he's apparently of Maronite background and speaks Arabic to some degree. I'm not sure exactly how much. Um, he condemns Sykes-Picot, so that's big. But I don't know. You know, it's with Trump, you can never tell. Like it's whoever talked to him last. And he's been getting along well with Erdogan and with MBS. So, yeah, it's about all I can say.
But do you see? I mean, he's basically going to implement the Washington policy. We don't know what it is, like you're saying. Do you see Turkey, Jordan, and regional nations coordinating Syria's needs if the U.S. does pull out? Because it does seem like it could happen at any moment, from my point of view.
So I actually think that the U.S. Well, this stuff's going to have to happen first. Initially, I thought that the U.S. When the regime fell, I kind of expected the U.S. to pull out rather quickly, and then when Trump came to office. But now, I actually think that they'll be there a bit longer until there's some sort of more concrete agreement with the SDF and the situation with the 10,000 or so Islamic State fighters that are in SDF prisons and the 40,000 family members that are in these camps. But in terms of the four country, the Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Jordan initiative, I mean that I don't know what to make of it really. This initially seemed very much like a Turkish initiative that was geared at convincing Trump that the U.S. could leave and everything would be fine. Now it's, I don't really know. But overall, I mean, I'd say in general, the regional, situation, Syria got very lucky that this happens with Turkey's whole rapprochement of the last couple of years, with now Iran's less of a factor, but even between the Gulf and Iran being in the spirit of détente as well. So I think that overall, Turkey Turkey has its other objectives in terms of the SDF, but overall, the regional states, the main regional powers, the main middle powers, are interested in just keeping the government afloat. So I think that's a positive for the overall situation.
Mm.
Obviously, there's a ton of political issues, and I don't want to sound super optimistic. There's the issue, say less so the Islamist issue, more so the issue of the centralizing of power in under the hands of Shara and these HTS cadre. Um, and yeah, actually, a friend of a friend put it to me that so with the Assad regime, Syria was behind this wall, and the wall isn't gone, but they've poked a hole in it, and they're sticking their head out of it. So I thought that was and then kind of looking around,
Who's they? Just to clarify.
Syrians in general,
Okay.
that it's they're through that wall, but not fully.
Mhm.
So I've been thinking about that, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to be a long transition, that's for sure. And the other major actor, which we haven't talked about yet, is Israel, right? There were airstrikes of military positions after regime change, and then Israel took different areas of land in the south. Uh, but Tom Barrack, the U.S. ambassador, said that Israeli airstrikes have stopped as of May 25th on his Twitter. Is that the case still? Have Israeli airstrikes stopped in Syria?
Well, that was the case when he said it, but that's no longer the case. There was a series of airstrikes in Jeble, in Latakia on the coast. Again, targeting a military base, likely targeting former regime military hardware, which has been the standard pattern. Yeah, and Israel's occupation, or its second occupation after the Golan Heights, of these areas on the border of the Golan Heights has continued. I think that occupation is going to continue indefinitely until maybe there's some sort of agreement actually reached with Damascus. In terms of the airstrikes, it does seem like this goes back into Trump's relations with Israel. Um, there's obviously, since the Gulf visit, it seems like there's been more distance between Trump and Israel, which I think might have been why things seemed a little cooler. Yeah, with these recent strikes, I don't really know, but I think overall, Israel is not speaking. Israel is basically trying to play spoiler to Syria, but maybe now with Trump taking a stance on it, they're less acting less aggressively than they were prior to May 13th when Trump announced the sanctions removal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do you agree with the general narrative where Israel wants a weak Syria instead of
Definitely.
a definitely?
Yeah, I mean, Israel right now thinks it can weaken every state around it, and it will unless the U.S. says something.
Yeah, and can you comment on the Druze community and what the relation is with Israel there?
So this is mostly based off what Eamon Tamimi's written. I don't really cover Sueda. I don't know too much about it, but generally it seems like the majority of the Druze population is split between those that favor closer integration with Damascus and those that favor federalism. And then there's like a very small vocally pro-Israel minority. So I think that gets overplayed. Obviously, Israel plays that up. But in terms of like the actual politics of Asueda, where most Druze live, the pro-Israel section is very marginal. And the main military groups either are in some sort of agreement with Damascus these days, or are in this sort of similar to the SDF, trying to like play along with the SDF situation and try to achieve some sort of federalism. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of annexation, that's like not a significant uh, factor, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're running into the last 10 minutes or so of this broadcast. If you have questions, please ask. I'll just get through a few more of my questions, and then if there's anything else, I'll relay it to you. Alexander, thank you again for your time. A few more points. Russia, what's going on with their bases and Russian troops in Syria? What's the current situation?
So Russia still maintains a presence in the Khmeimim air base, the Tartus naval base, and then last I heard, there actually was still Russian presence in the northeast in Qamishli airport, which has been a Russian base for years now, since 2019. Um, there, in terms of numbers, I think it's small. The Russian presence in Syria was always small. It was, never more than, I think it was always like under 10,000. It was mostly Air Force, and then using Wagner, and then just acting in an auxiliary role for the Syrian regime, the former regime. Negotiations are ongoing. I don't have any insight into how they're going. I think the Shara government has been. I assume they want Russia out at some point, but they've played it very cool, and don't see don't seem to see a need to alienate Russia. And we'll see. Maybe with the U.S. sanctions removed and the news that they're getting, I think it was UAE and maybe Germany to print the currency. Maybe because they still rely on Russia for printing the currency. So maybe with greater integration into the West, then maybe they'll pick a side more. But then people bring up also the military kit, which is all, Syria's army was all equipped with Soviet Russian weaponry. So that would mean replacing everything. I don't know. But I think eventually maybe the Russia will be gone. But I don't imagine it'll happen tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what about the Gulf states? What's their role in reconstruction, apart from financing?
The lobbying role that Qatar and Saudi played with Trump is obviously quite big. And Qatar's been funding. When people talk about the SNA and the civilian administration that was in these parts, the SNA parts before the fall of the regime, Qatar was paying for a lot of that, like through Turkey. Turkey was like the people facilitating it, but a lot of that money was actually coming from Qatar. So Qatar's role in terms of, and then Qatar was actually closer to HTS than Turkey was. So that the Qatar's role has kind of, been what it was. The Saudi role is new because Saudi had cut its ties basically with the Syrian opposition in 2015, 2016. And so that's changed. Obviously reconstruction, there was this $7 billion energy deal that honestly, I'm still catching up on this week's news because I do it week by week. But natural gas will definitely be a big part. I know that there was talk of connecting Syria to a Jordanian pipeline that's coming from the Gulf. Energy and money, and then this political capital, especially with Trump in office, I think is pretty huge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nice. I think we got one question from Emily. You mentioned the state news agency, Sana. Do you see an increase in press freedom since regime change?
There's an increase in most freedoms. I think less out of intended policy, more just out of limited state capacity. In terms of press freedom, it's been, I know, just speaking to friends that have had to apply as like a foreign journalist to the ministry, it's it's way easier, but at the same time, there's like the bureaucracies are all very short staffed, and the rules kind of change day by day. Um, I think, right now it's there's more freedom because the state's less present, but that's not necessarily an indication of long term trends. That's just the situation now. There's definitely been a kickstarting of civil society in Damascus and a return to some of the groups that had or the you know uh, currents that had operated early on in Bashar's reign, and then from abroad have come to Damascus. So that's definitely there's definitely a way more vibrant civil society within Damascus and throughout the country.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of this is that we have to wait and see what happens because it's still early, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and you mentioned the prisoner exchange between SDF and Damascus. Who was it
Yeah.
that was break?
So this is specific to the Sheikh Maqsoud area. This is like an enclave that's been SDF controlled forever in Aleppo city. Um, so before, because the SDF had, excuse me, this it had a complicated relationship with the regime. This had sort of existed forever, and now since Aleppo fell, the HTS led government didn't attack these areas. Some of the SNA groups did a little bit, but that was kept at like a ceasefire. And then following the main agreement that was signed between Shera and Abdi on the 10th of March, on April 1st, there was a local agreement signed between the local autonomous administration in these parts and with the government. And this included a prisoner exchange, which was supposed to be multiple rounds. Only one round had happened until today. Last I saw, like an hour ago, people were still waiting for it to happen. So there's a chance it might not happen. This was supposed to happen several times and got canceled.
Okay.
But yeah, it's part of this very local uh, part of the general agreement, but
And
specific to the city.
these are confidence building steps, I guess, between the groups that are could we look at those as a way to monitor how normalization is going, you know?
Yeah, it's also sort of a microcosm of what integration could be like, because I think before we see any sort of potential integration between security forces and also government institutions in northeastern Syria, this will be where anything happens first, because these areas, it's two neighborhoods, densely populated neighborhoods in Aleppo city that sort of like have to rely on the areas around it. So that's, and right now there's some security cooperation, whereas before it was sort of a frozen, not quite front line basically, but there wasn't much active fighting there. Now you have checkpoints where on one side it's the general security, the state's security forces, and on the other side it's the Asayish, the autonomous administration, internal security. So there
Mhm.
have been these things, but again, this over the last month or so, this kind of paused, and now we're seeing it kick back in. I think maybe that the Barak, his appointment, and I know he made a call to Muslim Abdi. Maybe the U.S. is actively trying to facilitate this more, but that's speculation.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else that you comment on for signs to see where everything is heading? I know that there's constitution talks, there's appointments to the government, right? Is there any other micro steps that we can watch to understand how things are developing moving forward?
Um, I don't know. I mean, to me, everything's happened like very fast and very slow at the same time. So with the appointments, I mean, overall, they've initially the transition, or the, what do they call it? The transitional government or caretaker government was almost all HTS cadre. Since then, it's been diversified a bit, but I think one of the main issues is that they're really going sort of like a deep political route where they're picking these technocrats that aren't actually, don't have any sort of political constituency, and there isn't a party. They haven't passed a party law that regulates party life. So right now there isn't actual political politics going on in any modern sense of the word in terms of like party politics. So I think that will be big. If that, hopefully that happens soon. And in terms of the Constitution, I mean, they're obviously taking their time, and it's worrisome. It's, you don't really know. People think they have their assumptions. Either Shara is secret Al Qaeda or going back to Al Qaeda, or modern technocrat, whatever, blah blah blah. But you don't really know. And yeah, I'd say just keep watching the constitutional aspects of it, and this party law. And with the SDF agreements, I mean, they're right now they're so far apart, I think, in terms of their vision of government, and also because the government doesn't have it has this constitutional document that's kind of was thrown together, and the SDF and the autonomous administrations rejected it because it's not democratic and it centralizes power in the president completely, and it refers to Islamic law as the only reference point for law. So yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but yeah, I'd say that these little local, basically everything in terms of the government SDF agreements is going to rely on these little things like the education system, or at least the test taking, not even integrated education system. What happens in Sheikh Maksud? What happens along the lines of contact along the Euphrates? I'd say that we're going to see movement in these areas first before we see any sort of big thing. And I don't expect a big sort of integration to happen for a long time.
Great, great. No, that's very helpful, and I want to thank you for doing this again. And everybody, thank you for joining. Thank you for your questions. To summarize, we've been talking to Alexander McKeever. He's a researcher based in Amman, Jordan, and the author of the newsletter This Week in Northern Syria. It's on Substack. I highly recommend following it if you're following Syria. And if you missed this live show, you joined after we started, you can find the full recording on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or turkeyrecap.com. I think you're also going to share it on your Substack, right, Alexander?
Yeah, I will.
Great. So thank you again, everybody, and look forward to keeping on watching what happens and following your work.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to all the viewers. Yep.
Great.